Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Women's Collective Office Hours in the last quarter here as we head towards the end of 2024. Before we dive in, I'd like to mention that our President and CEO, Madeline, is not able to join us today, but we do have her remarks that we would like to share.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Madeline Milka, President and CEO of APAICS. Welcome and thank you for joining us for our last Women's Collective Office Hour of the year. As a resource for our Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community on how to both enter and also succeed in public service, APAICS aims to help demystify the process so that government can be more accessible. Today, we are honored to have two distinguished speakers with us, Assemblywoman Erica Mosca from Nevada and Delegate Irene Shin from Virginia. Both of them serve as chairs of their respective state legislative AAPI caucuses. We are excited to hear from them as they share their respective experiences as public servants, including criteria, responsibilities, and personal considerations one takes when you answer the call to public service. We also look forward to hearing about their priorities for their respective caucuses in the upcoming term, and we appreciate their insights and participation today. I would also like to welcome the moderator for today's session, Susan Rowe, APAICS's new program manager for the Women's Collective. Susan has a background in program management, predominantly within public health, and she has worked with several U.S. government agencies, including NIAID of the NIH, where she collaborated with the Japanese health delegation and external researchers to organize an urgent call for COVID-19 vaccine research efforts across multiple participating countries. That call to action ignited her interest in providing support for our AA and NHPI leaders who serve at all levels of public service, and her heart is drawn especially towards our women in leadership. I know that she is eager to connect with all of the Women's Collective participants and hear your stories and aspirations, as well as challenges that APAICS can help address and the milestones that we can celebrate as a community. We're excited to have her as part of the APAICS team, so let's give her a warm welcome.
So, Delegate Shin and Assemblywoman Mosca, I wanted to give you both an opportunity to also introduce yourselves. Would either of you like to go ahead?
Thank you, Delegate. So nice. Well, congratulations, Susan. We're very excited for you and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here on this webinar. It takes a lot to take time to invest in yourself and take this time, but these are the really important steps, especially if you're interested in serving in public office, helping candidates, or just really getting involved. And so my name is Erica Mosca. I represent Assembly District 14 in East Las Vegas in Nevada. I'm a proud APAICS alumni. I did the candidate training program in 2016. So I know it's important foundational work in order for us to have representation throughout our country. And so I am the current outgoing chair of the AANHPI Legislative Caucus here in Nevada, was able to really raise funds, get us organized, and get us a strategic plan going forward, and can't wait to discuss more of that, but excited to be here with you and to share more later today. So thank you.
Assemblywoman, it's really nice to meet you. And thanks, Susan and Gwenna, for your help in pulling this webinar together. And also, welcome, Susan, and congratulations on your new role. It's very exciting. I'm Irene Shin. I represent the 8th District here in Virginia's House of Delegates. We are a 100-member body, and there's 40 senators and 100 members of the House of Delegates, and our AAPI caucus was first established a couple of years ago in 2021 in the aftermath of the Atlanta spa shootings. So our caucus has not been around for very long, and we only were able to just barely reach critical mass to establish a caucus, but I'm really proud of where we've come in the past few years. We went from being a caucus of 5 to a caucus of 8. And we are, representing the priorities of our AAPI community respectively and doing lots of good work. And I look forward to talking certainly more about that over this next hour.
Wonderful. Thank you both for participating with us today. So we'll kind of dive into a couple general questions for the both of you. And so the first one that we would love to hear your thoughts on are what inspires you to be in elected office? And please feel free to share like what inspires you now, as well as what kind of drew you along to this path.
I can take a first thing at that then. I often tell the story of when I first ran because I was first elected in 2021. And when I decided I was going to run, it was right in the aftermath of like all of the things happening all at once. It was Vice President Harris being sworn in as the first woman to hold that seat in this country. And it was also in the wake of the January 6th, like nonsense, insurrection, whatever you want to call it, right? And I would call it an insurrection and like treasonous, but that's me. This is an APAC C3 space. That was like in the context of what was happening, and we had also just come out of a couple of years of a lot of discrimination and like violence our community had faced coming out of the pandemic, with some of our leaders using really bigoted and hateful rhetoric that continued to inflame divisions, calling COVID the Kung flu or the China virus, right? That stuff hurt our communities in really tangible ways as well as in intangible ways. And it seemed to me that, it's sort of like this like perfect storm, and thinking about how representation mattered. We had just also seen Black Panther, we had seen Crazy Rich Asians, and we had seen Shang-Chi. And the idea that like all of our stories deserve to be told on the silver screen was a really important reminder for me when I saw Vice President Harris get sworn in, that representation at all levels, not just the stories about crying in H Mart and not just the stories about saving our world, but stories in which our communities are facing challenges and struggles every single day, that those stories also have a place to be told in the halls of power. And so it's not just in the White House, and it's not just at Congress, but it's at the state level, it's at the local level, and it's at the school board level, all the way down. I think it's incredibly important for representation and for our lived experiences to be a part of the conversations and in the rooms where decisions are being made. And that's really a big part of what inspired me to run for office. And I continue to be inspired to stay in office, because the work that is still ahead of us, that I think we still have so much to do to continue to preserve the idea of the American promise and the economic opportunity that we know America is capable of. I think that kind of work that we are still doing keeps me motivated to stay in this.
That's awesome. Thank you, Delegate Shin. That is really inspiring to me too. And I think remembering all of the large context that's just so important for the work we do. So thank you. And for me, I in Nevada is a little different. Nevada is a citizen legislature. I have a full-time job on top of this. It's really an unpaid role, so it's much more of public service in that you got to be angry about something and be an advocate, right? So for me, I was a teacher. I started and ran a nonprofit for a long time, and I had worked with students and families in my community, for over a decade. And there were just some very pragmatic issues, like students not having access to transcripts because they owed a fee in higher education, to having barriers for workforce development, such as internships during the school day. It was really like these things that I thought, gosh, why can't we just solve this? If I'm solving this for a couple of students and families who just happen to be in my program, how do we make sure that all Nevadans have these equitable opportunities? And so I ran for office in 2022. I'd always been thinking about it too. So that's important that I had done APAICS a while ago. It was always kind of on my mind. But for me, the timing was right in the seat. The seat that was up is a seat where I had done a lot of my work for a really long time. And so I decided to run to really come up with some solutions on things that I had seen on the ground. And so I represent a pretty diverse community, really represent coalitions coming together. And that's how we know that, our AA and HPI issues are the same as many other communities' issues. And of course, our representation is so important. So our folks can see that there is a path, but also how we are building power together to make sure we are empowering all of our communities.
Thank you, Assemblywoman and Delegate. I really appreciate both of your responses. And thank you for sharing a little bit about your background as well in education. And Delegate Shin for touching upon some of these other sources around us, including movies and books that really inspire us on many different levels. And yeah, it's really amazing to hear. Thank you. All right, so our next question for you both is for all the women who are trying to make a career in politics and really working in spaces that they never imagined working in. I think this is something that we all experience from time to time, if not at least once in our lives and throughout our careers. But how are you able to work through imposter syndrome?
And that's such a great question. And what I like to share with folks really is, so I'm the first Filipina to ever be elected in our state. I'm very proud of that, but I always say first, but not the last, right? We have to make sure that that's not that special someday, hopefully. And for me, I really talk about, gosh, the skills that I brought, I did not realize that they would translate so well. And so sometimes I think those are the things we forget to tell folks who are thinking about running. You know, for me, I naturally, if I'm going to have a bill hearing, I'm going to think about who are all the different people that I want to come talk about this, like students, like constituents, because why would I have a bill that I don't have a constituent who lives in my district that can say it's a problem or they're supported? And those are just very natural things that I came with based on my previous work. And during my last session, I was able to pass 5 out of 6 of my bills, really using that strategy. I had one pagers for all of my bills. That's what I had done in my nonprofit experience. And those were just things that I didn't think about. Okay, how can we really think about assets based about what we come with? And so at first I was definitely intimidated, but then I thought, let me use the skills I have and see how they work out, even if they're not the ones that are typically used. And so I'm really excited that next session I will be the assistant majority leader in Nevada in our assembly caucus. And I would tell all of our young women, our women out there, really it was using the things you already do. You know, you work hard, you know, you have lists, you know, you follow up and you respond back to people, you know, you ask other people for feedback because you don't think that you're the only one that's right in the room. So I just say these things that we already kind of do naturally actually lends itself to do really well when you are positioned to really believe in yourself, despite all the systemic and structural barriers that are out there. Really, I think just trying to be authentically you and kind of seeing it in the world. And of course, it doesn't always work out. So there have been times where I've had to see, okay, I'm going to show up authentically as me. It doesn't work in this current power system. So let me figure out how to go around it. But I haven't been afraid to at least just be myself and bring my assets to the table.
That's a really great segue into, I think I'm going to piggyback on some of those thoughts there, Assemblywoman, because first I would say the imposter syndrome never goes away. That's like, that for me is true. I like day in and day out, I'm always like, what am I doing here? And like, am I good enough to be here? And then sometimes I hear my colleagues and I'm like, oh, right, I deserve to be here, right? Because that's true, and the imposter syndrome doesn't go away. The challenge is overcoming that and showing up anyway, right, and being in this space anyway. And then I think to what the Assemblywoman was saying, the idea of serving in an office where the history of the institution and the levers of power that exist here are so fundamentally baked into colonialization and structures of white supremacy and patriarchy, it's really hard to like operate in this world. And like that is also true. I often share the story of my very first day. So I first won election in 2021 in November, and session starts in January 2022. So it's like my first day of session, and I wear a backpack when I come to work, but that's like, I've got little backpacks. So I carry my backpack around. And I'm in the elevator and I'm like bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and I'm so excited to be in this building. And I'm in the elevator, and it was actually the first session in which people had come back in person, because in 2020 and 2021 we had done a virtual session. So folks are in the elevator being like, there's like a buzz in the building about how exciting people are to be back. And some lobbyists are like, it's so nice to be back. I'm really glad to be here. It's so nice. And one of them looks at me and he goes, oh, like, so whose office do you work for? And I was like, oh, right. And it's this assumption of like looking at someone who looks like me, or who looks like Assemblymember Mosca, or who looks like Susan, right? And like seeing like, oh, like that's not how traditional like levers of power have looked or presented. And it is such a it's like innocent in a way, right? But it's also really insidious in that it's not, right? That they've always anticipated power to look like men, to look like white land owning men. And so when you're not that, in and of itself, the very existence of Assemblymember Mosca and me in these spaces challenges like what was traditionally acceptable. And I think that the fact that we get to serve in these roles and like lift our voices and bring our communities with us, it tells us that we also get to push the envelope that much further. In Virginia here, our capital is in Richmond. And I like to remind people that Richmond was the former capital of the Confederacy, right? So that's the backdrop in which we do all of this work, right? 1619, when our like the House of Delegates now used to be the House of Burgess, and that's what it was in 1619. It was comprised of 22 members who were all landowners, who were all white, who were all male, who were all owners of enslaved people. And so like that is the history of the body in which I serve. And like every single day I have to show up and like grapple with what it means to like learn to play within the powers and the confines of these systems, and also redefine what like transformational leadership could look like, right? What happens when we actually imagine a world that isn't just for white men, white male landowners, but it could be an economy or a commonwealth, or you know, any sort of noun here that is inclusive and welcoming for everybody. Like that's the kind of work that I think we get to do. And all that to say is the imposter syndrome does not go away. We just fight through it.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing. I feel so uplifted just from hearing you both already, as I'm sure many of our attendees also do. I just want to take a quick second here to share a comment that someone had shared on the side here in the chat. Yes, totally. Why it's so important we have each other, and I 100% agree. And yeah, hopefully we can all work towards and get to a time where it's not so like special and like out of the blue that we have our first Filipina Assemblywoman, and likewise our first Korean American delegate in Virginia. And so yeah, thank you for sharing. And I think that's a great segue to our next discussion point, which is we interact with so many different people who carry different backgrounds, different perspectives. And so, what are some tips that you might have on managing relationships with people who struggle to be open to those different perspectives and input?
I can take a first stab at this one. And I think there's two things to think about, because I struggled with this when I first came into office. Like I mentioned, it was sort of in the wake of the January 6th stuff, right? It was like it's still loitering very recently in the past for us. And I came into office when I was sworn in with a couple of other of my colleagues who were actively at the January 6th rally on January 6th. I was sworn in with colleagues who one of whom was a lawyer, and he flew on his own dime to Wisconsin to help them challenge the electoral counts. And they were people that I was serving with who like were like, no, Joe Biden did not win this election. And I was like, cool, like you're trying to overturn like the institution of democracy in our country. I don't know how I'm supposed to pretend to be like, hi, how was your weekend in the elevator, right? I was like, what are we doing here? Like we no longer share like a set of facts or truths where like we used to, right? Like there used to be, everyone would agree, like elections maybe sucked, it didn't turn out the way that we wanted to, but there was never this like, we're just going to assume the entire election was fraudulent. That wasn't part of it. And so it's been weird to work in this like post shared analysis of truths world with these folks. And still, there are ways in which we can work together on some stuff. In Virginia, we have a short session. We are also a part-time legislature, and things move really fast. We have 45-day sessions in odd years and 60-day sessions in even years. And so things are just like moving at a rapid clip. And that means that opportunities to build relationships require you to like do it outside of session. And so what I've always tried to look for, and I don't always find, but I try to look for points of like areas in which I think we are going to agree on something. And again, I have been surprised by things that I think we should agree on, and then we don't. But then I've also been surprised when I do have a thing that we can agree on and like look for those areas in which to make progress, because then it's like a nice feel good, like bipartisan effort to do a thing together. But that does not dismiss for me, or like it does not, how do I say this? I never forget sometimes who my opposition is, right? And I think that's really important to be clear-eyed about the ways that people perceive you as a threat to their power, and like where they're willing to make concessions, and knowing that you don't always have to actually play nice. Compromises is good, but you don't always have to play nice.
Yeah, and I'll continue with that. Thank you, Delegate Shin. Really, yeah, because it's so interesting, right? We think about winning and losing. I think about that a lot. You know, if I'm capitulating or if I'm finding a moderation, am I giving in too much? Am I sacrificing my values? And I have found, you know, where are my values? Whether they're within my own party that I don't agree with everything about, especially some education policy, versus it's not in my party. And so I think with this question, managing relationships, and it's really interesting to hear about other state legislatures too. We meet every other year. So next year we will go into session. We were not in session at all this past year. And so in some ways that gives me a little more time. So things like something that I did that has been really helpful for me is we represent all of Nevada. So for me to remember that, you know, I live in a more lower income working class neighborhood. I was a teacher not far from here in East Las Vegas, is very different than Elko, Nevada, or Pahrump, Nevada. I mean, it's an 8-hour drive. That's how big, you know, the states are here in the West. And I represent everyone. And there are 17 counties only, you know, in our state. 70% of the state lives in Clark County, which is in Southern Nevada, where Las Vegas is. And the other like 20% live in Washoe County, where Reno is, and the rest are the rurals. And so I made sure I could go to every county. You know, I went to all 17 counties. I, at least for me, visited all the superintendents, because I know making education policy is very different based on where you live. But it was important for me to say, hey, I've actually been in your community. So it has not been around like actually agreeing on things and, you know, getting bipartisan bills. For me, it's been around just a shared understanding that I've actually been to where you live or where you represent, where, yeah, there is like one stoplight. So maybe I have to have a very different conception of your reality versus my reality in Las Vegas that is very different. And so there has been, I think, a level of trust that is able to build. Now, folks haven't come to my district, right? So I don't forget about that. But I know that I can at least meet with these folks and talk to them in a way that there, at least that first foundational level is gone. And I think that that's just a good way to operate, because I think sometimes too, the other thing is I represent all my constituents as well in my district, whether they agree or disagree with me. So it's good for me to learn what are the other folks thinking about, why are they thinking about it that way, because at the end of the day, I represent the whole district and the whole state.
Thank you. Appreciate those responses from you both. Yeah, I think the common elements that I'm gathering here is that dialogue will always be a consistently important factor, no matter the setting, no matter who you're interacting with, especially as you both work for your constituents. And not everyone may always agree or share the same agenda, but just that constant effort to finding common ground, right? Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, I think we will now shift gears a little bit here, and we will go through some questions that are specific to you, Assemblywoman Mosca. Yeah, so the first question we have for you is, as you had just shared, you're making this transition from your current role to your upcoming role as Assistant Majority Leader in the next session. Congratulations. Very excited for you and for Nevada. So we wanted to take this opportunity to ask you how this might affect your leadership style, if you foresee any changes. Someone's wishing you congratulations in the chat. Yeah, if you'd like to touch upon that.
Sure, sure. Yeah, I think that's a great question. No, I hope I don't change, right? That's the whole thing about politics is we should always hold our politicians accountable that they should be the same person they were before they ever had a title. And that's the best way, I think, to make sure people don't change who they are based on power. But for me, it's really my chairing the ANHPI caucus has really been such an honor for me. There were 7 of us, and now we have 8. So I'm glad we have the same amount now. Our caucus actually started in 2019 before I was there, but it was more informal. And so with my background of starting organizations and leading organizations, it was the one thing I took on to say, okay, let's come up with a strategic plan. Let's raise money. We started our PAC. We raised over $100,000. We brought over 110 community members up to our session during our ANHPI Heritage and Lobby Day. And so I really think that doing the work, following up, letting people know what you've accomplished. So I think sometimes, especially in my party, like we do so much and we like have all these wins, but we somehow sometimes are uncomfortable then parroting them back out to people. Hey, I did this, I did, and I think also our ANHP identities, we're always taught to maybe not do that, not toot our horn so loudly. But I think that's one thing that helped through the ANHPI caucus and everything we were able to grow and feeding back people, letting them know all of our wins so they could join us, not to say we're awesome, but to say, now join us and let's scale and let's help more people. I think that is one part of which allowed me to have this next rule. So I'm hoping that doing that, doing the work, following up, being willing to meet with anyone and everyone, and then sharing the wins later is going to be something that I continue to do and can help even more Nevadans at scale.
Yes, definitely. There's a lot of value to even just sharing for the sake of awareness for others to know, right? And to share in celebrations as well for those milestones, certainly. Thank you. So we understand that Assemblyman Wen has been elected as the next chair. And given you still have the next year and Nevada serves every other year, as you had just shared, would you mind sharing what were your priorities for the next term? And also, what were your strategies for keeping the caucus cohesive in the short time that you have? And also, specifically to Nevada, where do you find common ground in Nevada?
Yes, yes. And so it's interesting, even though we meet every other year, I think one way we're able to keep consistency, not all the identity-based caucuses did this, but we're glad we did. We kept meeting. So we kept meeting every other month, and then we got to a point where we met every month. So even though we haven't been in session, we as our group have still been meeting, which are actually my most frequent meetings I've had in the interim. So that really helps. And for us, it is 7 very diverse individuals, diverse backgrounds, diverse districts. And so at least the thing we were able to come up with that we all agreed on, which is actually a lot harder, I think, within all 7 of us than sometimes the rest of the group, was language access. So we did push and advocate very hard for language access at the ballot box, on our elections in many ways. It got vetoed. In Nevada, we are a purple state, as you know, and our legislature is Democrat, our executive branch, our governor is a Republican. We passed it in both houses, but we couldn't get it signed into law, so it was vetoed. And so that is something that we are bringing back for next session. We at least got language access. Assemblyman Wen had a bill on prescription medicine to have different languages. So we got that one passed, but we did not get the general language access for elections, ballots, and local government. So we're bringing that back.
Sounds great. All about passing the torch next to Assemblyman Wen, right? Yeah. So as you had touched upon briefly, you have an admirable and extensive background in education, both for yourself as a first-generation college graduate and your contribution to our nation's education system through your Teach for America service in Las Vegas. Thank you for all that you've done. I know a friend who's done Teach for America in Baltimore, and I know it's not easy. My younger brother is also an elementary school teacher down in Dallas. And so I I know that he'll also find your insights very valuable too. And you also have a number of other achievements in your role with U.S. Congressman Stephen Horsford's Equity Cabinet, as well as the impact you're making through your own nonprofit that focuses on nurturing youth leadership and professional development for educators. How have each of your experiences in education propelled you to grow in your public service career? And also, what advice would you have to share with current young educators who might be looking to make a greater impact within their local communities and beyond?
Yes, I think that's a great question, and thank you for sharing. I always tell any young educators I'm working with, first, thank you. It's a very hard work. I think it's even harder post-pandemic, as we know. And I think really it's about finding the role that fits you. You know, success is not linear, and we're in chapters. You know, this is my current chapter. This doesn't mean this is gonna be my forever chapter. You know, I'm not angling to continue to do this forever. But for me, I got to a point. You know, I worked in the classroom for 3 years. I then worked in policy at the superintendent's office. So I saw high level. Clark County is the fifth largest school district in America. And when I was at high level, you know, I was like 25, 26. I craved that impact. So that's why I started my nonprofit. And then, you know, like 10 years after that, I'm like, grassroots work every day, you know, being on 24 hours, you know, seeing my students grow. They're like 26, 27 now. I knew them since they were 10. You know, I got tired, you know, burnout is real. And so for me, it was like, what fills my cup to do next? What skills can I use? So this is what worked next for me. And I think that's just important for folks to know is you can contribute at any way that works best for you, and only you know what works best for you. And so it's about preparing yourself, though. The thing is, when the seat was open, we have term limits. I was one of the first, I think I was the first person in mind, but it was because I had put myself in that position, right? So I had been active in the community. I had made changes at the legislature, not as an elected. I had organized students to come up to session. I had brought students to session because I wanted them to just see what their state capital was. And so I think it's about being where you feel you're making the most impact for you, and that's the right thing, but position yourself to be ready for that next chapter when it's time.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Such golden nuggets of wisdom for our current educators out there. Appreciate that. So we'll transition here with our questions for Delegate Shin. You've done noble work to improve communities throughout Virginia, including the 8th district that you serve in Northern Virginia. And I wanted to share, not to go off on too much of a tangent, but I live in your district. Chantilly is in the 8th district. So I was really excited for you to join us today. Your focus areas have included enhancing Virginia's healthcare system, resources for individuals with intellectual disabilities, combating exploitative profiteering in our correctional system, as well as animal welfare and protection. Thank you for all your hard work and your continued hard work. And so as you continue to lead in your service, what are the priorities that you see next year for Virginia?
Thanks, Susan. Also very exciting that you live in the 8th district. It is the Great 8th, as we have dubbed it. And so I'm very proud that you are a constituent in our district. That is a good question. I think to make it slightly more like salient for folks who don't know, Virginia runs in an odd year cycle. And so our state legislatures are up in odd years. And so oftentimes when things happen at the federal level, for example, a presidential election, the immediate first aftermath happens in Virginia. And so in 2016, when the 2016 election happened, in 2017, we saw a huge swing where in Virginia to the Democratic Party, right? And then in 2020, when we had that presidential election, in 2021, when we had a gubernatorial race, we saw a little bit of a swing back to the right, right? And you see that pendulum swinging in terms of electoral politics, like no place more clearly than in Virginia, because this is the first place where people get to park their outrage or joy about what's going on at the national level. And so that's going to be a big part of the work that we do next year. I think for both myself and for our caucus next year, we're going to continue to prioritize and work on the themes that we have over the past few years. Obviously, healthcare access is a big and important priority for not just Asian Americans, but also all Americans. The American healthcare system is so broken that I think that's a priority for all of us always, including language access, affordable housing, economic opportunities, and a little bit of a surprise for me was when we did some polling a year ago, we learned that gun violence prevention is actually a really important topic to Northern Virginia AAPI community. And so like knowing that, it's been really interesting to get to work on some of these gun violence prevention bills because it's not the first thing that comes to mind, but I guess in the ways that we talk about like AAPI communities are American communities, like American communities are AAPI communities, right? So all of those issues are kind of interchangeable. I think again, being sort of in this APAC C3 space, without talking too much about the partisanship, I think there will also be some big issues next year. I don't know if Nevada does ballot initiatives, but in Virginia, we don't do ballot initiatives. Okay, so we do constitutional amendments. So there's no direct democracy. If you want to have the voters directly vote on an issue on the ballot, it has to get passed through the General Assembly 2 times before it goes on the ballot. And so next year, we'll see 3 big constitutional amendments. One is going to be to repeal the Marshall-Newman Amendment. Back in 2007, I want to say, Virginia decided that marriage was only between a man and a woman and put that into our constitution. Obviously, with Oberfeld, that became an irrelevant constitutional amendment for us, but we feel like it's appropriate to go and remove that out of our constitution and then affirm the equal right to marry for all Virginians. That's one amendment. The second amendment is going to be to restore voting rights to folks who are coming out of the carceral system after they've done their time and they've paid back their dues to society. We believe that they should have their voting rights restored because in Virginia, we are one of the final states in the whole country that do not give automatic rights restoration. So a person who was maybe convicted of a felony will go do their time and then come out and have to submit an application to the governor to ask them to restore their right to vote. And the governor can choose at his discretion whether he does or does not. And so under this current administration, there have been like in the past 3 years, like 27 applications that have been approved. And so we are trying to say like it's a constitutional amendment. If you served your time, you did your part, you're going to come back out and we want you to be a contributing member to society. So you should have the right to vote and choose who represents you in office. That's on amendment number 2. And then amendment number 3 that we're pushing next year is going to be enshrining reproductive access. So whether that's to fertility care, to prenatal, postnatal adoption care, and contraception, and of course, abortion access. We're going to try to enshrine that right in our constitution to make sure that no matter what's happening at the federal level, Virginians and people who can get pregnant coming to Virginia will always remain protected.
Wonderful. Lots of exciting areas to look forward to in the next year. Thank you. And as the first Korean American to serve as delegate, very proud. What guidance do you have to share with other AAN and HPI women in Virginia who might aspire to kickstart or grow in their public service career? Considering there's a good number of us all throughout Northern Virginia, Fairfax County, and beyond.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a question that actually I think Assemblywoman Mosca touched on a little bit too, right? It's this idea of like stay ready so you don't have to get ready, right? And she talked about that like she was ready when because politics, I feel like timing is everything. Like you have to be prepared to jump, and so don't waste time getting ready. Just like stay ready. That's a big lesson. For me, I ran against a Democratic incumbent when I decided to run for office. And so like that was a big lift, right? And that for me meant being ready to like seize an opportunity when I saw it and like being like, cool, we're going to mount this campaign and see how we can do. And I think that that's a big part of it. I will say there's probably a little bit of a distinction between folks who are looking to enter a career in public service versus folks who are looking to grow their career in public service, because we're talking about either staying in a lane and then like continuing down that lane or coming into a new lane. And I will say oftentimes I find that moving laterally into politics or public service is sometimes a hard barrier. There are like barriers you face. And so my advice to both, though, wherever you might be, is to talk to people. I think that if you see someone who's like doing a thing that you think is really cool, go and talk to them and be like, I'd love to learn more about what you're working on. And that if both for like if you're moving into the sector or you're just trying to expand your own like understanding of options out there for you, I think that's really important to think about. I will also say be prepared for the thankless job that public service sometimes is. I think Assemblymember Mosca touched on it a little bit too, but here in Virginia, we are a part-time legislature. So my annual salary is $17,640, which is wild. I did the calculation last year for like how many dollars is that if I was making an hourly wage, and it's $12.25. So it is a very hard job. And so like know that coming into this, and that also know that there are folks like Assemblymember Mosca and myself and my colleagues who are women and women of color and moms and folks who come from like not privileged backgrounds necessarily, who are trying to figure out how do we make public service more accessible. And one of those things is through modernization of our legislatures. How do we make sure that legislators are compensated for the amount of work that they're doing? If you have to be retired or independently wealthy to be able to afford to serve in office, you're never going to get a legislature that actually represents the communities accurately. And so how do we break down those barriers? I think there's a lot of really good work going on to try and make it a little bit more accessible and manageable for the next generation.
Thank you. Yes. Working towards a more representative democracy is a goal that we all share. And so thank you for your insights. And yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that the most important thing to do really is to go right to the source. If you see someone doing that inspires you or is the right resource that you could learn more from. Yeah. And so how has your work as an executive director to the nonprofit that you're leading, Virginia Civic Engagement Table, for those who may not know, how has this contributed toward your overall mission to help residents in Virginia thrive in a safe and healthy environment?
That's a great question, because the work that we do and the work that I did at VSAT is really about increasing civic education, and this idea that representation matters, electing people who are from your community, who know your community, who look like your community. That's important, but it's the community being able to show up, whether it's at the ballot box or it's going to be in session to testify on a bill. Like that's really where change happens, right? And that's not to diminish the roles that both Assemblymember Mosca and I get to play, but it is to say that it requires all of us to make our democracy a healthy and multiracial democracy. Some of that I think is seen, for example, we led the coalition work around census counts in 2020, and it's incredibly important to be counted in your census. But like most families don't know that, right? And here's why it's important, because that's how school boundaries are drawn. That's how hospitals get decided whether your community gets a hospital or not. That's how they decide on SNAP and TANF benefits in your school, right? All of those counts are so important. I think that the idea that civic engagement is only tied to policy or advocacy, I think is sort of a misnomer. And so really the work that we were doing was trying to make sure that everybody felt like they could play a role and had a voice in building a multiracial democracy here in Virginia, where we could all effectively advocate for the policies and the kind of Virginia we wanted to live in and build together. And so some of that work meant that we, like, the census stuff is part of it. It's the advocacy part of it. It's the redistricting part of it, right? Like when your maps are redrawn, how are they counting your communities? Do you get to be a community of interest, or are they splitting up your district and your neighborhoods, right? Those are all parts of how civic engagement play a role in this. I think it's been really helpful for me to be able to see it from an advocacy perspective and then bring some of those lessons learned into my role as a legislator.
Yeah, thank you for your efforts to expand civic engagement. Just having that knowledge base and education is the pinnacle of everything. So really appreciate that. And then this last question for you. What are some of the positive changes that you've seen within Virginia and in terms of community and government enhancement, as well as civic engagement and vice versa? What are some of the areas of improvement that you can identify and highlight as potential projects for future AA and NHPI women in public service? I realize it's a very loaded question, but
Well, I think for the first part of it, in terms of like what are some of the positive changes we've seen within Virginia, um, just in the last 5 years, we've seen marked change in Virginia. Again, to remember that Virginia is, that Richmond is the capital of Virginia, and Richmond used to be the capital of the Confederacy, and like that's the backdrop in which we do all of this work. In 2019, Virginia was ranked the 49th worst state to vote in. And in 2020, we had lots of good wins where the Democrats took a trifecta. We had the governor's mansion, the Senate, and the House. And in just that 2 years, we took Virginia from being the 49th worst state to vote in to becoming the 9th best state for voting rights in the country. We are the first state in the South to end the death penalty. We are the first state in the South to have our own Voting Rights Act. We are the first state in the South to pass affirmative abortion access rights, and we are currently the only state in the South since the fall of Roe that hasn't enforced any other restrictions on a woman's access to care. And so those are all really important pieces of progress. But if I could tie them back to the way in which the demographics of the makeup of the General Assembly have changed, you would be able to see a direct correlation. When you elect more people of color, when you elect more people who are representative of their communities, when you elect people from different lived experiences and backgrounds, you actually end up with policies that are more reflective of the real priorities that come out of our communities. And there's a direct correlation to that. And that, I think, is a really cool image to think about, right? When you there's a Rachel Maddow screen that will live in my head forever in 2017, where Democrats, again, in the wake of the 2016 election, Democrats took 14 seats held by Republicans previously, and it was 14 white men. And all of those faces changed on screen on the Rachel Maddow screen cards. And it was like the first Latina woman, the first Asian American woman, the first Filipino woman, the first Vietnamese American woman, the first openly trans woman, right? It was just a marked, drastic wave of change. And I think when you can elect people who represent your communities and more accurately, you get a better set of policies under which to live by. And I think that is a very clear correlation and story for me.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I wasn't aware of these drastic changes that had taken place in Virginia, going from the 49th all the way to the 9th. That's a huge jump. Lots of improvements there made. And yeah, really appreciate you sharing your insights as well as the goals and priorities you have set for the next year. Thank you for your hard work in Virginia and for you as well, Assemblywoman over in Nevada. You're right. It is very thankless work, but very valuable and crucial work that you both do. We are just down to the last 4 minutes here. We'd like to open up this time to any other questions that we might have from our attendees. Please feel free to include them in the chat. I can go ahead and read this out loud for everyone. Lin Wen is asking, thank you, Delegate Irene, Shin, and Assemblywoman Erica Mosca for sharing your insights. I appreciate this office hour so much. My name is Lin Wen. I am running for mayor of DeKalb, Illinois, located 60 miles west of Chicago. The local ruling class is opposing my ballot petition despite my submission of nearly 3 times the required signatures. This appears to be a strategic move to undermine my campaign, creating significant barriers for ordinary citizens and compromising the democratic process. I am appealing the City Electoral Board's decision to remove my name from the ballot in the circuit court, but I am also considering a write-in campaign. What advice do you have? Should I let it go? Are there organizations that can help with fundraising and strategies?
I'll start, but thank you, Lynn. I mean, this is very difficult. I'm sorry that you are going through this. I think for sure with APACS, I mean, whatever way APACS can support, I think is important. And I think with this is sometimes the only advice I would say, because I don't know the local context, is what is like the long-term plan. So is it, do you want to mount a huge media strategy right now on social media? Do you want to write an op-ed? Like, is that the route you want to go? Is it that you want to then really use this as motivation to organize folks for the next time the seat is up, so that they can't do this again and come back to them? So I think for me, at least, there's a general thing is always to think about what is the short term, what is the long term, and what are you really trying to gain? I'm excited to hear what Delegate Shin thinks too.
Yeah, I am super interested in this because some of the things that I dealt with during my time at the Virginia Civic Engagement Table have to do with election protection and election sabotage. We talked a little bit about, the January 6th insurrection, this idea of election sabotage, and again, C3 space, but sometimes I know that our opposition is more invested in election sabotage as a means to overthrow institutional trust in public trust in institutions, or public, sorry, let me rephrase that. Overthrow public trust in institutions. And so if that, I wonder about how much of this is a piece of that, right? Are they trying to disqualify you from being on the ballot as a means to subvert people building power? And I would imagine that there's probably legal strategy here. I would talk to if there are any legal groups in your area. The ones that come to mind for me at the national level, there's an organization called Lawyers Committee, and Lawyers Committee runs the National Election Protection Hotline. And this would be, to me, like maybe something that could pique their interest, because if it is election sabotage, rather than waiting till the outcome of the election to overturn an election, they're going to try and subvert the will of the people at the front end of it. And that might be what's happening, without knowing too many of the details. That would be the first thing that I think about, but I'd certainly brace yourself for what could be a messy litigation and litigious process, because whatever the ruling is of this electoral board, you should consider appealing it if you feel like there are opportunities to do that, and like create a narrative around it that says like, they're trying to diminish our voices, they're trying to suppress the vote, whatever that might be, right? And so I don't know exactly who the go-to is, but I'm sure APAICS certainly is a resource for you and pointing you in the right direction. And certainly if you feel like you have the moral high ground here, and like you think that you're right and the courts will side with you, like take it all the way to court and then turn it into a stink fest. That would that would be my advice.
Thank you both for your responses. And Lynn, I hope that this was helpful to respond to your initial question. I have made a note of it. Okay, she says, I am taking all the way to court. Thank you. And she shared her website. Okay, not seeing any other additional ones. So I do believe that concludes our final office hours of the year. Thank you so much, Assemblywoman Mosca and Delegate Shin, for joining us today. We really appreciate your participation and for the valuable insights that you both have shared with us. And our next office hours will coincide with our Her Story event in March, so please stay tuned for that. Otherwise, we hope everyone enjoys a wonderful holiday break coming up, and we look forward to seeing you all again in the new year. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you so
Susan.
much.
Happy holidays, y'all.
Take care. Bye.